Fabrice, welcome to the show. Great to have you here.
Good morning, Brad.
So, we've been talking about something called the second adulthood. What exactly is that? What does it mean?
The second adulthood is what happens to you essentially when you reach midlife around 45 or so, and no one has a name for that, which is why we called it second adulthood. It's a fundamental shift in life where the models that we've been using to direct our life in our 20s and 30s suddenly start not working so well. And what's interesting is from a leadership standpoint, all the models that we have, all the books of leadership that have been written in since the 70s, Peter Drucker and Tom Peters and all these guys, they all wrote these books when they were in their 30s. If you think of it, 30s, maybe early 40s. And so no one has ever looked at the field of leadership and conducting your life from the perspective of someone who's already in that second adulthood.
Well, what do you think changes from the first to the second adulthood? What have you noticed with the people that you work with?
The first shift is the end of striving. We start our lives. And it may vary depending on personality and culture and gender, but by and large, we start our lives and we are striving. We're striving to prove ourselves, we're striving to grow, we're striving to be successful, we're starting a family perhaps, we're growing in our careers, we're making money, we're accumulating wealth. And that is the game that we play in the first adulthood. That game, for most people, starts becoming less interesting, less exciting. And perhaps, more importantly, we're not so well suited for that game anymore when we reach our 50s and 60s because the brain changes, the physiology of the brain and the body changes. And so what's made us successful in the first adulthood is not what's going to make us successful in our second adulthood. So that's the main changes that we see. And it's interesting to see that because the whole leadership literature and the whole models that corporations use to drive employees, measure performance, KPIs, etc., is an entire system that is geared for first adulthood, not for second adulthood.
Makes a lot of sense. And people try to continue in that mode as they progress into second adulthood, and that's when you start to see some problems. I think it's so interesting, the idea of striving. I've experienced that. It was just all about that action, momentum, achievement, and everything is geared toward that. And then there is a time when you step back and go, is that actually even necessary? I've experienced it recently, and I've realized creating space for creativity, for reflection, is in fact the key to success at this point in my life. I'm 48. How does someone deal with the fact that you don't have to strive to be useful? Because I think that's the mindset for many people. It's like, if I'm not striving, I'm lazy.
The first step, I believe, is self-awareness, is to realize that something has changed in you. And perhaps you're no longer the person with all the answers. We're very good at problem solving, finding patterns when we're in our 20s and 30s and perhaps early 40s, because the brain works essentially on what psychologists call fluid intelligence, which is really raw IQ, raw horsepower. I'm going to crack that problem. I'm going to make this happen, right? And it's driven by the need for certainty. Once you reach the second adulthood, first of all, the brain that is driven by IQ, that fluid intelligence, peaks in our late 20s to mid 30s. So it's a long decline, man. And there's no fighting it, right? Suddenly you forget where you put your car keys, and you met someone yesterday and you've forgotten their name. That is the decline of fluid intelligence. However, there's another form of intelligence that starts increasing with age and actually doesn't peak. As far as I've seen the research, it continues improving and increasing all the way into the 70s and 80s, which is what the psychologists call crystallized intelligence, which is the ability to, what you called, the space, creating more space, being able to live without the answers, being able to hold contradicting viewpoints without feeling anxious about it, the ability to rely on your accumulated knowledge, accumulated experience to provide wisdom. That is not something that you can do in your first adulthood. First of all, you don't have the experience and you don't have the knowledge. And you don't, therefore it's very hard to produce wisdom. And so there's great usefulness to people in the second adulthood. It's just that the models, the leadership models, the corporation models that we have built are not exploiting all the value that people in their second adulthood can create. In fact, we don't even have a name. If you think of it, right? Up until perhaps the middle of the 19th century, we didn't have a word for adolescence.
Really?
You were a child,
Mm-hmm.
you grew up, and then suddenly it was time to work. And you transitioned from childhood to adulthood around the age of 13, 14, 15, 16. You're a child and suddenly you get married at 16 or 18, right? There was nothing in between. There was not that buffer zone. And when we started creating a word for it, adolescence, then the whole system followed. We created schools, we created the courts and the justice system to protect the children so that they don't start working at the age of 13. And now we take it for granted that there's childhood and then there's adolescence and then there's adulthood, right? It's the same shift that happens with, today we don't have a word. We go from adulthood into old age. And we don't recognize that buffer zone that is actually what I call the second adulthood. And that is a zone of transition where we can bring a completely different value to the world. But today, none of the systems that we have are recognizing that. And so we still live in a world that assumes that every adult is the same. We all want to strive, we all want to succeed, we all want to accumulate wealth, we all want to prove ourselves, we all want to get a great performance appraisal at the end of the year. We all want that promotion because that's a system that is built on first adulthood. And every book that I've seen, all the major books have all been written by people in their first adulthood. So I cannot blame them. And these are great thinkers, right? But from Peter Drucker to Tom Peters to Jim Collins to all these guys, they all wrote their leadership book in their 30s. And so I think we've taken that literature for, the only truth that exists in leadership, which is people want to progress, move up the ladder, make more money, get good performance appraisals, control outcomes, right? Which is a typical first adulthood mindset. I need to control outcome. But control doesn't scale. Once you move up the ladder in corporations, you cannot control what happens anymore. You can control a team, maybe. You can tell people, micromanage a small team. But when you're leading 10,000 employees that is composed of teams, there's absolutely no control. Control doesn't scale. So we don't have the vocabulary for that.
That's really interesting. So the first adulthood is all about optimization. That's what I noticed. Even down to your physicality, it's like metrics and KPIs and wearable data and biometrics and let's optimize my health. I've encountered a lot of that. I've done it myself because you gain meaning from all of that. Like, okay, small achievements, I tick to KPI. And now you have to discover your own kind of meaning. Like if it's not about hitting goals and targets, where does the meaning come from? And what do you think from your experience working with people? Is it rediscovering a sense of purpose? How can people navigate this without having a midlife crisis? We should have a midlife celebration instead of a crisis. And maybe we should reconnect with what really matters to us. It's such an opportunity at that age.
Yeah, no, I think you're hitting the nail on the head, Brad. It's not a crisis to start with. We call it midlife crisis. I can't remember who coined the term midlife crisis, but it's ridiculous, right? It's a transformation. It's a period of intense growth and recalibration. For me, it's an awakening, right? What a lot of the executives that we work with who are in their 40s are actually awakening to a new way of looking at their lives. And they don't have the tools to make sense of that. They don't have the tools to create meaning, as you say, right? Because suddenly it's not about having all the answers. Having all the answers is a first adulthood mindset, right? Again, as I said, it's raw IQ, it's problem solving, it's, fixing technical challenges. It's all about fluid intelligence. It's about striving. And what you described, the hacking mentality, I'm going to wear a ring, I'm going to wear this, I'm going to take that supplement. It's all a first adulthood thing, right? It's great. I mean, I loved it. I really enjoyed my first adulthood. I think I was pretty good at striving and but at some point you say, what is my value if I no longer have the answers? because you realize that you will never have all the answers anyway. And so there's a questioning, how do I keep adding value if I don't have the answers? How do I keep adding value if I've lost the appetite to control everything, right? So that's the shift. I don't need to continue accumulating. So what can I bring to the world? My capacity of synthesis, my wisdom. How do I turn this into a productive way, right? And also there's another shift that happens in the later part of the second adulthood, which is you realize that you're not immortal. Mm-hmm. And so when you realize that you only have a finite life, you start being pretty selective on where you spend your time and what you ascribe meaning to. And you realize perhaps these new accounts that we absolutely have to win and this new milestone that the boss has fixed. Maybe I don't really care. Maybe that's not where I want to spend my life. Maybe I want to spend my life on activities that give me a sense of fulfillment and meaning. Maybe I want to spend my life with people who give me a sense of fulfillment and meaning. And that also transforms the way you look at the world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think companies can find ways to accommodate this, or not only accommodate, to actually celebrate people who are good at synthesizing? Maybe they're not hitting the same types of KPIs, but they shouldn't probably have those same types of KPIs. It's more about mentoring. One of my favorite quotes is success is succession. So you have these people who have the wisdom and the ability to integrate things, because we have AI, right? AI is full of answers. So you don't need to have all of the answers. What you need is the interpretation and the mentoring of young people. What do you think from a company perspective? How could they shift to really embrace the second adulthood?
I think there's many ways that people in their second adulthood create value, and de facto, right? If you look at the senior ranks of large corporations, every man and woman who's at the top, in the C-suite, they're usually in their second adulthood. And so even though we don't have the vocabulary for what they do, instinctively, that's how many of them create value, right? Which is bringing wisdom, bringing judgment to situation, being able to hold the paradox, right? A is true, and B is also true. And it doesn't mean that I need to choose between A and B, which is usually the way problems are presented to us. Either you do that or you do that, but you cannot do both. And people in their second adulthood tend to be very good at holding the paradox and not freaking out when two opposite truths or two opposite propositions can be true at the same time. Mentoring, as you said, creating the succession, the conditions for succession, preparing the next generation to lead. That is all the domain of second adulthood. Delegating, right? I hate this word, but empowering, right? Empowering others. I mean, it's a terrible word because if you think of it, it means, in general, we disempower people.
Yeah.
Corporations take power away from people. Corporations treat people like children. And so as if now that I empower you, I've discovered something, but you should have been empowered from day one in the first place.
Of course.
Right?
That makes so much sense. Can you tell me about something you mentioned earlier on? Because I think it's connected to this, which is you said as you progress up the ladder in a large corporation, you lose control. And I've never thought of that. I always, it's people look at a CEO and say he's got all the control. But in fact, you've maybe got more influence than control.
It is exactly. I mean, you're at 100%, right? It's how do I influence situations, which means guiding, nudging, creating the conditions for, when I don't have the control. Control is a term that comes from, solving technical challenges, right? So if I'm a mechanic and I work on jet engines and I'm fixing them, I want to control the outcome. The reason why aviation is the safest mode of transport today is because we control outcomes. You don't want the captain to come on the PA when you're about to leave the gate and you're going to start to taxi and the captain says, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really going to do my best here, but we're going to see how that goes and there's really nothing I control here. So, I mean, you would totally, freak out and you would jump out of the plane immediately. So there is a space for control, right? But that's a technical world. What happens in positions of senior leadership is that most of what we do tends to touch human systems, markets, and these are adaptive challenges. These are not technical challenges. So trains running on time, that's a technical challenge, right? And we can control outcomes, and we should control outcomes. Maybe performing a surgery for your cataract or your appendicitis, that's a technical challenge. You want to control the outcomes. But what we do in leadership positions, at the helm of large human systems that interact with markets, that interact with regulators, that interacts with a world of competitors in economic conditions that are influenced by, a billion different factors that we don't understand. That is not a technical challenge. It's an adaptive challenge, and you don't have control. You can shape, you can influence, you can probe, you can experiment, but you don't have control. And that's where people in their second adulthood tend to be very good. As long as, and the big awakening is to realize that if you continue playing the game of first adulthood, right? If you're 50-year-old or 60-year-old and you want to compete against the folks who are 30, I tell you, you're going to lose that game, right? I see that in my own life, right? And as a partner at McKinsey, if I try to be smarter than my associates and my engagement managers who are 25 years or 30 years younger than me, I'm going to lose that game. They are smarter than me. So the awakening is realizing that I'm not going to win at the game that the 30-year-olds are playing. So I need to find my own game. And that's the game of wisdom, the game of judgment, the game of holding paradox, the game of creating conditions to thrive in the face of complex adaptive challenges.
Yeah, that's a better game. And actually embracing that game is an important part of the growth. Do you think that what we lack is, in fact, some rituals to celebrate? And I wrote about this in my previous book, Start With Values, that there used to be very real rituals. If you were part of a tribe, as you became an adult, it was celebrated. Maybe you go and spend some time in nature, you come back, and then you become, a leader perhaps, and that's celebrated, and then an elder, and that's celebrated. We've lost those kinds of rituals and milestones that turn these life changes into positive moments rather than something to grieve. I've lost my youth, for example, which is a challenge, but we should rather be celebrating the evolution into something new, a new form.
Yes, but for that you need guides, right? So you're right. We have lost our rites of passage. We used to have rites of passage from childhood into adulthood, right? Even though we didn't have the adolescence phase, but there were elders that were guiding you in the most important transitions of your life. And so, for example, from childhood to adulthood, right? You go into a phase where you're going to get married, you're going to build a family, you're going to become reasonably self-sufficient. And so that's a big transition that many people don't do very well. And if you look at it today, right, a lot of supposedly adults are still living in the realm of childhood and teenage years. They still live with their parents. They're not necessarily financially autonomous. They don't want to create families. They wait longer and longer to get married, and then maybe even if they live with a partner, they don't get married, which means there's no commitment, right? And we're scared of making commitments that we would have found very normal 100 years or 50 years ago. But in order to make these commitments, you need the support from the elders who guide you, they mentor you, they explain to you why that makes sense to make a commitment to one person so that you can live your life and build your family, etc. And the same with the rites of adulthood, right? We're in a system today that pretends that we remain in first adulthood for the entirety of our career, and then when we retire, basically it's game over. And you stay at home, you watch Netflix, you go play cards with your buddies, and maybe you take care of your garden. But that's it, right? And there's no recognition that, first of all, this game of first adulthood stops working for you when you reach your midlife. So we need to recognize that there is something else, and we need to have elders who have lived through these transitions and can accompany people to make sense of these transitions. And there's very few people around for that.
And this is part of the work. Yeah, please.
Is geared towards, controlling, treating people like children. I see that in the coaching. We coach very senior leadership teams of very large corporations, right? So I will coach the CEOs, and my team and I will coach the C-suite into becoming high-performing teams. Most of the executives in the teams that we coach are in their second adulthood, And if I look at the literature, again, most of these leadership books, the wisdom of teams and the 5 dysfunctions of teams and all this stuff, which is good material. I'm not saying this is bad, but it's all written from the perspective of first adulthood and telling people what to do because we as coaches are supposed to know better, which is complete nonsense. Mm-hmm. As a coach, I don't know better. And I cannot tell my executives what to do, or if we create breakout groups, telling them who goes in what group, which is very much a first adulthood mindset. I've seen people say, please don't take your phones, keep your phones in your pocket, etc., which is very infantilizing. Mm-hmm. For me, dealing with people in their second adulthood is fundamentally trusting that they know what to do, and we just need to create the conditions for that wisdom to emerge. So coaching executives is very different. When you coach someone in first adulthood, you can be really a guide and really supporting them and giving them mental models, etc. And in a way, almost telling them, what are the choices that they have. And occasionally you could even advise them on what are the better choices. But you don't do that with people in their second adulthood. Fundamentally, you have to trust that they know what is good for them. You just create the conditions for that realization to emerge.
Do you have any examples, without, of course, revealing names, of people in second adulthood who did embrace the change, who actually did shift how they were operating in the world?
Well, pretty much all the leadership teams we work with, we have a very, very light hand. And that's not when I was witnessing and learning, etc. I would see, team coaches arriving and they would have a list of activities, they would go, okay, now everybody's going to introduce themselves with these things, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do that. They would pack the day with activities, exactly the way you would do that in a primary school, right? Children, please listen to me. Keep your phones away. We're going to do this activity. Let me tell you what we're going to do next. When we coach the leadership teams of large corporations, we use silence a lot, right? We say, okay, what would make this a great day? We listen a lot. Everything that these executives, these teams feel that is the most important topics that they want to reflect on together, that comes during that check-in phase when we listen to what is going on in the room. And at the end of the day, when we finish, a day or two-day retreat with executives, we look back and we say, what did we do really? And it's very little in terms of speaking and telling people what to do. It's a lot of holding space for them, because we find that senior executives in second adulthood don't need to be prodded and nudged and incentivized with carrots and sticks. They just want someone to hold the space for them to figure out what needs to be done. And then we reflect, we play back what we hear, what we see. Our role as facilitators is very, very light. And so you were asking for specific examples, but it's really pretty much every C-suite we work with where we are very, very light-handed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a hallmark of dealing with executives, particularly in second adulthood. I'm using executives and leadership because that's the work I do. But if you were a life coach for someone in their second adulthood, the approach would be exactly the same. It's not about you're going to hack your sleep by wearing something, and you're going to do this and you're going to take that supplement. It's about what is going to create meaning for you at this stage of life.
Mm. Mm-hmm. And what about the phase when people are leaving? I remember my father had to leave Ernst & Young age 60 because that was the rule. For people who have to navigate that transition, because a lot of your identity has been attached to your role at work, any thoughts for how they can navigate that phase into having the space to play golf or do whatever they do? Or do you think it's really connecting with another project, having passion projects?
Yes, absolutely. But it's my experience is that a lot of senior executives, because they're so busy when they are in what I call active duty, is that many are not well prepared for entering, the later stages, retiring, etc., which is the later stage of the second adulthood, if you want, right? My colleague Anis Haddad, whom calls it the third adulthood, right? But so identity and fusion with the role is obviously one of the biggest hurdles, right? Is if I am my job, if I am my role, if I am my title, then who am I when I don't have that title anymore? And that's obviously in the retreats that I lead for senior executives who are about to retire. I regularly organize these retreats where men and women in their 50s, sometimes early 60s, right, join my retreats. It's who am I and what is my value when I no longer have a title, when I no longer have the job, the CEO job, that has basically made me successful. And that is an important recalibration, is to, particularly when you've not been prepared for it, right? Because you haven't really had time to say, okay, what gives me a sense of meaning when I'm not a CEO? Or a senior executive or a partner in a consulting firm. I see that at McKinsey every day with my partners. We and I'm also guilty of that. Of course, the firm is asking so much of us that we tend to merge with our roles, right? And it's not that easy to say, okay, who am I? Who is Fabrice when he's not a partner at McKinsey? Who is Brad's dad when he's not a partner at EY?
Yeah. It's a good question. And I think that the work you do around retreats and creating that space, and as you said, that silence might be one of the keys just to reconnecting. Because otherwise, if we've just been in that state of busyness, endless busyness, we'll continue to create busyness. I don't know if you've experienced that. I have worked with many CEOs who say, if I get to work and it's quiet, I create the stress because it feels normal, and then everyone is stressed, and at least we're back to the default state. But in fact, there's a level beyond that where you can actually say, in fact, I create space, and that ripples across the organization as the anchor, the foundation of calm. But yeah, maybe you could tell us a little bit about the retreats that you run.
Yeah. This creating space, stillness, that is a superpower of the second adulthood, if only we're allowed to use it. Because as you said, in the corporations, busyness is the norm, right? How are you doing? Oh, I'm so busy. Oh, then great. Right? Everything is good. If I'm busy, everything is good, right? And if there's nothing on my plate, then I start being anxious because I wonder, oh my God, if my mailbox is empty, my inbox is empty, and then what is my value?
Yes.
If we allow that space actually to be used, and that stillness to be used for a time of reflection and for letting new ideas emerge, etc., then that's the superpower of the second adulthood, right? So as you know, I wrote a book on retreats and how to use time in silence, in solitude, in stillness, not to withdraw from our responsibilities, but to make a pause. And using that intermediate period, it could be 1 hour, it could be 1 day, it could be 3 days, however long we can afford, to recalibrate, reset, build self-awareness, build awareness of the system in which we operate. Because that deeper awareness of what is creating meaning for me, what is giving me a sense of fulfillment, how can I best be useful to the system that I lead if I'm in a leadership position? All these answers take time, right? All this discernment takes time, and it doesn't happen when you're in a constant state of excitement, beta waves for your brain, noise, constant notification, emails, WhatsApp, meetings. That is not the space where your best thinking, your best realization, your best self-awareness emerges. You never get your best ideas when you're glued to your computer screen and answering emails. Right?
Never.
You probably get your best ideas when you're walking in nature, or when you're taking a shower sometimes, or when you lay in bed in the middle of the night. That's when the best thinking emerges. So one of the superpower of this second adulthood is our ability to recognize that creating that space, that silence, that stillness is actually not detrimental to our leadership roles. It's actually a fundamental building block of our leadership role. And so going back to the book and the art of retreats, it's an exploration of how can we use periods of stillness, of solitude, of silence to let our best leadership emerge.
It's a great book, and I recommend it often to groups that I talk to. I recommended it to a group of CEOs on Wednesday, and they were fascinated by the fact that you didn't need to go for a physical retreat, although that is recommended for sure, but that you can find a retreat in the midst of a busy day. And it's just about disconnecting from the noise. Do you suggest any specific practices? Do you think meditation is an important practice, or there are other types of practices to just be still, as you mentioned, walking in nature, for example?
There's many practices. Meditation is one of them. For others, it will be prayers. For others, it'll be taking a notebook with a blank page and just start jotting down whatever comes to you. For other people, it will be walking in nature. I think it's just what's important is this notion of silence. So, and nowadays, what does silence mean? It means disconnecting. Right? We cannot be in a world of silence when we're carrying our devices. So just disconnecting creates a space that we don't have when we're constantly glued to our phone. And so it doesn't mean that you go into a place that doesn't have noise, right? You could do a retreat for 1 hour sitting in a coffee shop if you want, but you have to be disconnected. So silence, solitude, of course, being on your own with yourself, which a lot of us, young people in particular, have lost the ability to do. You know, if you're in a queue at the coffee shop and there's 25 seconds to wait until you're going to be able to place your order, we get the phone immediately because we freak out when we're with ourselves. We've lost the ability to be with ourselves. And you're in the bus, you're in the subway, you know, constantly there needs to be music in your ears, listening to a podcast, looking at messages. You cannot just be sitting with yourself. So we've been completely disconnected. We're completely alienated from our own inner life. And so the practice of retreats is really meant to reconnect you with your inner life, because I'm absolutely convinced, and I've never seen that not happening. When you are reconnecting with yourself, the answers emerge.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not connected to yourself, then you're always looking for the answers outside of yourself. So you're going to some guru, you're going to some, you know, YouTube influencer, whatever. You think these folks have the answers for you because you're just not able to listen to yourself. So that's the fundamental, you know, so whether it's meditation or just sitting in nature or walking in nature or going for a long swim on the beach or whatever, it doesn't matter. But silence, solitude in a space that inspires you.
Mm-hmm. I certainly know. I was so happy that in my traveling years, I spent about 4 years traveling through Asia, through Europe, through Africa, and I didn't have a smartphone. Intentionally, I took an old black and gray screen Nokia, and it was remarkable because you find yourself being so present to the world. You're actually just really open, present, curious, and it's a shame that so many people have never experienced that because they've just grown up with social media, push notifications, fragmented attention. The research from UCLA, the average attention span is 47 seconds, which is terrifying. But as you say, you can cultivate it. It's all is not lost. You can basically build these skills like any other through some basic practices, just disconnecting for a few minutes a day, and then maybe it becomes half an hour, and then eventually you're doing meditation. It's up to you.
Yeah, all is definitely not lost.
Yeah.
There are many practices that can help us to find that space. Back to our earlier conversation, I think the people in the second adulthood can be guides and mentors to help younger generation of leaders to be more comfortable with that space. And not say, oh, you know, if I'm not busy, then I don't add value.
Yeah.
Which is a young person's anxiety creating mindset.
Yes.
And,
yes.
You know, we develop leadership programs for our clients at McKinsey. So we design and we deliver these programs. A lot of the executives that come to these leadership programs are aspiring C-suite. So they tend to be, you know, the up and coming, high potential, super bright people that are pushing the end of their first adulthood, right? They're usually in their late 30s, early 40s. And I see how much they freak out when they're not busy, even in periods when we ask them to be fully present. So we ask them to look inside and reflect. You know, there's a lot of practices that we bring to these leadership programs that is based on self-awareness, understanding what triggers us, what are the narratives that we carry from childhood that are holding us back in our leadership world. Right? Narratives of control, narratives around pleasing others, you know, conflict is bad, conflict is dangerous, which are all narratives that we inherit from childhood and that have helped us to survive essentially the childhood, right? And even when we ask them to be in a period that is more reflective and maybe exchange with their peers, they still have to check, you know, what's happening back in the office, because if I'm not on top of it, if I'm not controlling what's happening with my teams, you know, then I'm not adding value. And And a big part of what we're trying to do, sometimes more successfully than others, is to say, look, you're not adding value because you're checking your email every 5 minutes. That's not at this stage of your leadership, and definitely when you go to the C-suite, that's not what people expect from you.
You in fact need to be creating the emotional climate for your organization. I often think of it in terms of weather. Like if you are calm amidst the storm, that ripples outward. Isn't that the key to great leadership, is to use your nervous system to create that emotional contagion across the organization? We may not have all the answers, but we're all together and we're on a journey and telling a great story. Isn't that a huge part of leadership?
Yes, it is. And I have one word that encompasses everything that you've just described, which is presence. And presence is really something that every spiritual tradition has explored and given us different tools, right? Whether it's meditation, whether it's prayer, whether it's silence, whether it's being with someone and really being with someone, giving them your 100 undivided attention without interrupting them, without jumping to give them the answers, just being present. That is so difficult to practice nowadays because you could be in a meeting and checking your email at the same time. So the body is in the meeting room, but the mind is somewhere else. So we live this life of fragmentation where we're always doing 3-4 things at the same time. Even when somebody is telling us, something, when one of our subordinates comes and says, hey, boss, I have a problem, we barely have time to listen to them. We're already jumping to tell them the answers or interrupting them to ask more questions, as if asking and asking and asking and asking is going to lead us to the best answer, right? Instead of letting them speak without interruptions, holding the space and see where they go with it. Because when you hold space for someone, they will find their own answers. One of the exercises I do with executives that we work with is we say, you're going to go in pairs, and one person is going to talk about a problem that they have, and the other person is just going to hold space and stay silent. And they look at me and they say, okay, boss, for how long do you want us to do that? And I say, well, 6 or 8 minutes. And they completely freak out. They say, how can I be silent for 6 minutes? And I say, try. And they try. And they're like, oh my God, when I was holding space for someone else, it was so relaxing. When I stopped thinking about the next question I'm going to ask, when I stopped thinking about how I'm going to fix their problem, because that's no longer my job. My job is just to hold space. And when we debrief the person who's speaking about their problem, etc., with someone in front of them, right, that is holding space, when they have the certainty that they're not going to be interrupted, suddenly their thinking blossoms and they usually solve their own problem. Right? And I credit Nancy Klein for that. She is a thought leader who's worked a lot on holding space and being silent and creating meetings, for example, where people know that they're not going to be interrupted. And it just liberates the thinking, allows the best ideas to emerge in ways that are unbelievable. So back to presence, right? For me, the core competence number one of leadership is really being present.
Yes, I 100% agree. And it is a fascinating experience. I remember when I first started coaching people many years ago, and you feel this tendency, first adulthood, to be problem solving, analyzing frameworks, and it can be useful. Maybe it looks impressive, but nowadays it's really just about listening, letting people solve their own problem. I'm coaching a young boxer at the moment. He's a very elite level boxer, and most of what I do is just sit there. I'm just there listening, every now and then nodding, and every now and then we do a breathwork exercise, and that's actually all that he needs. It's quite amazing. And that's the wisdom of a second adulthood coming into play.
I couldn't have said that better, Brad. You've just captured it, right? Being present to others is a superpower of second adulthood. If and only if, number one, we can cultivate it, because we've been so indoctrinated in being agitated and having answers and speaking all the time that even when we get into our older age, we can stop doing it. So number one, we have to cultivate that capacity to be present. But number two, we have to feel that we have the permission to be present. In a world that is extremely noisy, in a world that expects us to say something, in a world that expects us to make decisions immediately instead of sitting with it and doing nothing, sometimes it's much better than jumping into action. Right? I'm not saying don't make decisions usually, a bad decision is probably better than no decision at all. But there is a time to be in silence and contemplation before you do that.
I increasingly realize that non-doing is a super skill. In fact, sometimes just let things happen, and it's so much better than having been in there fighting. And often the right result happens, but it just took a little bit more time, a little bit of patience, and that's certainly a skill from second adulthood, I believe.
Yeah, well, it's almost a spiritual practice. You know, we live our first adulthood with a mindset of addition, right? So I need more knowledge, I need more money, I need more titles, I need more stuff, right? And in second adulthood, there's this what Meister Eckhart, the great spiritual thinker of the 12th century, said. It's a spirituality of subtraction. Less is better.
Yeah.
And so we go from more is better to less is better. And that goes back to what you said earlier. It's creating, when there's less clutter, when there's less noise, when there's fewer words, we create the space. And from that space, wisdom emerges. Wisdom about what to do, wisdom about what not to do, wisdom about how to relate with each other, wisdom about empathy, wisdom about compassion. Right? That emerges from space, from a spirituality of subtraction, not a spirituality of addition. I'm not sure there is a spirituality of addition.
Probably not, no. Unless you think of it in terms of a negative entropy, like sometimes you need to pull things together, but that's not that's something different. It's actually coming together as opposed to just adding. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Can we expect any exciting book announcements? You don't have to say, but I just think there's something so powerful in this idea of the second adulthood.
Yes, so probably not immediately. It's been a very, very interesting last few years where, my team and I have experimented and created approaches to coach the most senior leaders and C-suites with tools that do not come from, the literature that was written by folks in their 30s, but really coaching approaches that are really suited for second adulthood, which is really this less is better, less is more, very gentle nudges, letting people find out their own answers and not coming from a place of control, but from a place of letting go. So that is very counterintuitive in the corporate world, because if I use all these words, create space, be silent, let go, do not try to control. I mean, this is the kind of vocabulary that gets you fired very quickly, right? So we're trading very, very gently, but it's okay, because we're not our clients, right? So we can approach and use all these tools, but it's really for their benefit. And we've seen countless leadership teams really blossom when we help them figuring out that they have such power if they only spend time together, fully present, do not rush, spend time in silence, embrace the ambiguity instead of trying to control it. Then we've seen leadership teams really, really, really blossom in that. So I don't know when the next book will come, but it's slowly maturing in our head.
Very exciting, very exciting. If anyone would like to connect with your other work, The Art of Retreats, or follow you on social media, where would you like them to go?
LinkedIn is a good place to start, and my website, desmarescaux.com.
Excellent. Fabrice, thank you so much. It's a pleasure as always. I'll include all of the links in the show notes. Any final thought for those who stuck with us all the way to the end?
I think being, trusting, having faith that the slowing down, the creating space is not counterproductive to being successful in second adulthood. It is actually the practice, whether we call it meditation, contemplation, retreats, nature. There is a space for that in the vocabulary of second adulthood that makes us successful in that second adulthood that has been completely ignored by the leadership literature. And I think having that faith that it works, trusting the process is what I would leave our audience with.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time.
Thank you, Brad. I really enjoyed it.